It's almost like we're baking this climate cake, and the way that we mix these different 3 ingredients together is what really matters, because you can't separate them. You cannot just say, here's our decarb strategy, here's our climate resilience strategy, and there's our nature restoration strategy, and treat them as independent things, because sometimes the solutions to one bit help the other bits, sometimes they don't help the other bits, but you need to understand how it all goes together. And of course, once you've done it, you can't undo it.
Hello and welcome to WSP's Positive Impact podcast. I'm your host, Lucy Siegle. In this series, we explore the ideas, innovations and voices shaping a more sustainable, resilient and future-ready world. Today, we're facing the triple challenge of climate change head-on. How we prevent its worst impacts, adapt to the changes already here, and restore the natural systems we've lost. We're going to unpack what this really means for our infrastructure, our industries and the environment. From decarbonisation to climate resilience to nature-positive solutions, we're talking about the big picture and how to act on it with confidence. Now, joining me are 2 leaders who know this territory inside out. Rachel Skinner, Executive Director of UK Government Relations and Corporate Responsibility at WSP, and David Riley, Head of Carbon and Climate Adaptation at Anglian Water. Should we get started?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we've got a lot to get through. David, I'd love to start with an overview of how you approach climate action at Anglian Water. Where did you start? Where are you now? Where are you aiming for? And of course, you're going to tell me all of this in about 3 minutes. So good luck with that.
Fantastic. Yeah. So my carbon journey really started in probably about the year 2000. And I was an energy operations manager, and somebody asked me about carbon. And my response back then was, why do we need to measure carbon? It's irrelevant. So over the last 25 years, I've realised how wrong I was back then. So in terms of why carbon is important to our organisation as Anglian Water, the water industry and UK infrastructure as a whole, is that if we think about our changing climate that we're seeing right now, we can either put our head in the sand and just wish for things to be okay in the future, or we can actually start to do things about it. And doing things about it means how we play our part in terms of reducing our carbon emissions, how we ensure that our assets are resilient to a changing climate, and how we recognise the importance of nature glued into that. So we've been really focused on delivering carbon reductions and understanding the climate since probably around about 2006, where we recognise from a long-term strategic perspective that climate change and also population growth were 2 of our most significant challenges. And when we think about a changing climate, that is that when we're seeing more dry periods, when we're seeing more storm events, when we're seeing the tides changing in terms of impacts on our coastal region. So all these things start to play a part in terms of how we are planning for the future in providing a really important resource, and that's water and recycling water back to the environment.
That all makes a lot of sense. And I love the fact that you started from a position of why do we need to do that? You've really come on quite the journey. What sort of technical standards have you sort of relied on? And do you take, I suppose, inspiration from other countries, other places? How do you sort of approach, how do you know where the good stuff is and what to follow?
Yeah, it's a good question, Lucy, because when we started in terms of looking at carbon, there was very limited guidance out there. And I always see this as a behaviour change initiative. So over the last, again, 25 years, what we have seen is a growth in frameworks, a growth in standards, etc. One of the keys of that is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is a recognised standard of how we measure carbon across the globe. And then more recently, we've seen things like the Infrastructure Carbon Review through our UK government treasury, where it's almost about the leadership aspects, the innovation and how we have collaboration in this space. And then we've had PAS 2080, and that's really been a step change in terms of our approach. PAS 2080 is a framework for how we manage carbon within infrastructure and the built environment. And that's all about that leadership, the measurement, the reporting, the collaboration that's required across the value chain. And the difference here is that it looks at how we measure these things from a product supplier, from a constructor, from a designer, and from Anglian Water perspective as an asset owner. And we find when we're all challenging ourselves in similar ways, when we're measuring and have targets in place and that leadership in place, and we're all aligned in our ambitions, that's when the magic happens in terms of really understanding where our carbon hotspots are and delivering the carbon reductions that we need, but also cognizant of that changing climate and resilience piece as well.
Rachel, you're nodding. You're in violent agreement, you two, on a lot of that. I can see you're wearing your Global Goals badge, and it's lovely to
every day.
I love this. And take us back, if you will, to COP26, because a lot of us remember COP26 in Glasgow with a lot of fondness, because it seemed like the place where this cohesive climate action felt very dynamic. It felt very alive. Could you tell us what it brought from your perspective, and what's its legacy? Especially, I'm very interested in your infrastructure client group role, particularly going to focus on that now.
No, absolutely. It felt like a moment off the back of the Paris Agreement that obviously predated that by several years. It was a moment where people were coming back together again and saying, right, this piece around decarbonisation towards net zero still really matters. I think at that time, we still hadn't fully unpacked the detail. We hadn't fully understood what we meant by that. I suspect we'll come back to that a bit later on. But actually, there was a common understanding this was a topic that we need to stay on. So a lot of the focus at that time, at that event, was on the decarbonisation piece. So where David was speaking just now about the fact that actually in reality we've got three things to think about. We've got to decarbonise towards a global net zero position. We've got to make sure the world is sufficiently resilient and able to cope with the increasingly extreme events that we're going to be experiencing, like it or not. And then we can do all of that with the help of nature and nature restoration, because actually it can do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. The first bit of that was very present at COP26. Very much so. The second two pieces, in my view, were less so at that time. And of course, there's a whole separate COP process running to do with nature, which has nothing to do with the, at that time, at least, the pure, if you like, climate related pieces. But I think what we're seeing and what's happened in the meantime, I guess, is really a joining together of these different themes. So in that same year when COP26 was happening, and again, depths of COVID and so on, it was also the year when I was president of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And my chosen theme was climate action, because I could see, very similar to what David was just saying, that we'd been on a bit of a journey, but the point had not landed. It was not clear to built environment professionals what their role could be in actually doing something about it, if you see what I mean, rather than just saying, oh dear, we've got a problem. You had local authorities. In a UK context, they'd all, 80% of them had declared a climate emergency by that time. You had national government, you had Theresa May, who'd inked in the changes in a regulatory sense in terms of saying we have a legally binding obligation to get to net zero by 2050, which still stands now. Yeah. All of those things were in motion, but we didn't have the full picture. So at that time, I used to describe this whole sort of climate action piece, and I kind of learned through my ICE year how to describe it in a way that people could pick up on and understand. I, at the time, was very much describing it in two parts. The sort of the attack strategy, so take the carbon out of the system, whatever it takes, just get rid of it. So take the carbon out, that's the decarbonisation piece, attack strategy. Then there was the defensive piece around climate resilience in terms of, how do we make sure that we're ready to cope with what lies ahead? Because even if you take the carbon out, it's going to take decades for the systems to adjust. That worked. But then more recently, I've started to describe it with, I spent a while talking about three legs of a stool on the basis that a three-legged stool usually sort of stays upright unless you try really hard to knock it over. The three legs being decarb, climate resilience and nature restoration. But then I've realised even more recently that actually it feels more like we're sort of doing some sort of like cooking experiment or something. It's almost like we're baking this climate cake, and the way that we mix these different three ingredients together is what really matters, because you can't separate them. You cannot just say, here's our decarb strategy, here's our climate resilience strategy, and there's our nature restoration strategy, and treat them as independent things, because sometimes the solutions to one bit help the other bits. Sometimes they don't help the other bits, but you need to understand how it all goes together. And of course, once you've done it, you can't undo it. So I find that quite useful. And we've seen that coming to the infrastructure client group side of things, which I know you were keen to talk about. Yeah. We've seen that exactly that journey. So the infrastructure client group has existed for quite a long time, but at exactly the same time in terms of COP26 and so on, we also, I guess, reformed what was then an infrastructure carbon task group. So this is where David and I came into contact with each other on a far more frequent basis, across what was then close to 20 infrastructure clients across the country. And they all basically were keen to talk about, okay, how do we work together? Exactly to David's point, how do we get more organised and go in the same direction at a faster pace on decarb? But now the journey for the infrastructure client group, exactly the same. We've broadened it out across all three streams, and exactly the same question applies. What is it that this group of infrastructure clients can do together? And it's now grown to about 25 clients in the group. So it's all the big UK infrastructure providers across transport, water, energy, waste, digital, etc. What can they do together for the greatest, most impactful change? And that's what we're trying to do.
That's where we are.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I don't think any of us will now forget the climate cake metaphor. Can I just say I'm very taken with that? It actually moves me on to my next question, which I've been really looking forward to this moment. A bit sad. I know, like me, you both feel strongly that language around climate action needs a bit of tidying up. Can we put it like that? And precision is quite important. Could you run through a few examples for us? Rachel, I'll come back to you first.
Sure. I'll try and be brief. You're absolutely right. This is a real bugbear of mine, because what I hear and see out there in the industry across our different sectors very often is people who've picked up that there are certain words they feel they should be using, but they actually haven't taken the time to really understand what they mean. They haven't understood them in context, and they certainly haven't understood that the definition of some of these words has been shifting over time. I mean, net zero is probably top of that list. You know, people sort of saying, oh, yeah, we're going to have a net zero this and a net zero that. And you think, stop. What do you mean? What are you talking about? There is no such thing as a net zero, very, very small thing, because all that really matters is the net zero outcome, across the whole thing. And I guess it's really difficult because for two reasons, really, actually. First of all, the language has shifted.
Yes.
Things we used to say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the definitions have changed. Mm-hmm. So all those policies that exist at national and local government level that all speak to, will be net zero in many cases by 2030. Quite a lot of places around the UK have said, and quite a lot of organisations have said, those targets were set with the best of intentions. But the reality of the complexity and the scale of change that's actually needed means that those timelines are not realistic. Mm-hmm. And so to keep repeating these myths and to keep misusing these words is actually really unhelpful. Yeah. I think it's also fair to say that there's a second piece going on. Very often it's the people in more senior responsible roles who feel that, of course they should be fully versed in using some of these words. This is not inside their comfort zone. It's not the areas they were trained in. It just wasn't on the radar. Exactly as David just said, you have to go back very far. Mm-hmm. And it simply wasn't part of, the academic sort of training process. You weren't doing, climate topics at school or through university, that kind of thing. So it's really quite a challenge, isn't it?
Yes.
To figure out how to inform yourself enough, but at the same time call it out when you see the poor behaviours. But yes. I do make it a bit of a mission to, if I spot it going on, to kind of gently but clearly kind of make sure that you leave behind a bit more information around what some of these words do now mean.
Yes. Yeah. Good retraining in a constructive way. Yeah, gently does it. So David, just staying with this topic, I mean, there is a lot of jargon as well, isn't there?
Well, we love jargon to make carbon sound as though it's a really complex area, and it's not. It's not. So it's almost becoming lazy in terms of when we're using those terms around net zero, carbon reduction, etc., because it's very easy to bash it when you don't really understand it. And we've done lots of consultations within Anglian Water and the water sector as a whole in terms of talking to customers about, do we need to be reducing our carbon emissions? And it almost made me feel a little bit uncomfortable, because I thought, if we're asking our customers and society around doing something and what they're reading in the media and the press around, is it a good thing? Can we afford to do it, etc., entirely misses the point around reducing carbon is as much about business efficiency as it is about sustainability. Because when you look at when you're actually measuring carbon emissions and what we mean by that, and the terms we can use. So we use the term scope 1, which are our direct emissions that we have on our operational sites. And that in reality means how much fuel oil are we using? Where are our nitrous oxide and methane emissions? Where's our transport emissions from vehicles that we use? Our scope 2 emissions, the grid electricity that we use, the heat that we're using, and our scope 3, the indirect emissions of the emissions through our supply chains. When you start to break it down in that sense, you understand where my carbon hotspots are. And we know that when we're using energy, when we're using materials in terms of how we operate our businesses and how we build our assets, that also is aligned with cost. And so when we're reducing energy through becoming more energy efficient, or if we're starting to use renewable energy, or if we're starting to use less materials that are energy intensive in terms of what we build, we also start to reduce our cost in terms of operating our business as well. And so when you start to break it down like that, actually reducing carbon becomes a good thing because it is a broader aspect rather than just of some of the sustainability things that we can speak about. But Rachel's entirely right in terms of using those terms incorrectly or misunderstanding what they actually mean can take us down a path when we start talking about the language rather than the actions that we need to take.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I'm always pushing hard in terms of trying to avoid using that language, especially when I'm talking to our design engineers or our suppliers or our partners from a water company perspective, and talking more about what are the actions that we need to take, and let me be concerned about how we then go about reporting it. Because where it is really important is when we're being audited and when we've been verified against the actions that we take, because that's where the greenwashing comes to play.
Yeah.
So understanding what those terms mean, understanding where we've actually taken action and reduced our emissions, and then being audited against the right language, that's where I see it as important. When we're having those broader conversations about actions that we need to take, sometimes we don't need to mention the word carbon.
Wow, wouldn't that be a revolution? I really like that refocusing as well. And, not just talking about language for language's sake, which I think we do a lot, and actually, tying it to actions is incredibly important. Let's zoom out, if we may, to UK government support. So how have national policy and priorities helped or hindered, let's speak freely and honestly, progress? Because for a while now, there's been a movement to get nature risk, for example, recognised at the top table. We referred to that earlier on. So let's check in on that too. David, may I start with you?
I think this is like a roller coaster ride. It felt like that over the last 25 years, where it's been a priority and then there's other priorities that come to play, and then suddenly it's not important anymore. What we miss out on when we're talking about government leadership in this space and actions that we need to take as businesses, etc., is that net zero isn't going to go away. It's not as if we can wait until 2050 and then start to take some action in this space and everything will be all right until that point. What we're already seeing is the climate changing. So in 2022, we had the hottest day ever recorded within the region of Anglian Water in Lincolnshire when it was at 42 degrees C.
Wow.
Now, I'd never thought that within the next 10 years, when I started my time at Anglian Water back in 2010, that we see anything like those sort of temperatures. And we hadn't planned for those temperatures. We thought those were going to be in the future. So when we're looking at what the government are doing in this space, when we're looking at what industry is doing in this space, I think it's now getting to a point where we need that consistency and urgency start to be brought back to the fore again, rather than being distracted by other things that are taking place. And that's where the ICG is really good in terms of the infrastructure client group, because that includes for government departments within there, the Green Construction Board that we have. And what I've seen in that 20-year horizon is that when government and industry come together against a collective ambition, when we're trying to do the right things for the right reasons, then government are willing to listen to areas where we can actually take forward. And one of the key things that's important right now is how our approach to reducing emissions, how our approach to building resilience, how our approach to nature is also adding to the GDP and the revenue and the economy of the UK. Because I think that if we miss out that point in terms of the connection into the economy, that's where we start to have a disconnect. When we recognise the advantages and the importance of nature, the importance of reducing our emissions, the social capital and the intellectual capital we get from that, that's when it starts to actually gain momentum.
Yeah.
And that's where government are really interested.
And do you think you have all the tools that you need to describe that properly and to chart that properly?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it comes back to what we were talking about previously in terms of the language that we are using. Because if we go into some of those government meetings and start talking about the technical detail about the language used, it's almost, why is this relevant to what I do? It's almost making it relevant and telling that story in terms of, if we are reducing emissions, that means what does renewable energy look like? And if we've got renewable energy, how does that make us resilient to some of the impacts that we've seen when the price of oil spikes, or that technology or that chemical that we are using is no longer available? That's where the resilience, the reduction in carbon that we're looking at, the nature aspect really starts to make a fall. But it's using the language where there's a connection between all of those. And I'd say that's about the system. And when we've got system thinking in place in terms of organisational system, the physical infrastructure systems that we have and the data systems, that's again where the magic starts to happen for us to understand we can't look at these things in silos.
So David's choice of word is roller coaster. Rachel, what's yours?
I actually really like that description, although it does imply we're on a path that's somehow predictable, perhaps, which I might come back to in a second. But there we go. We'll go with it. Yeah. So we're all on the ride. When it comes to kind of, I guess, a much bigger picture for a moment here, there's an international dimension here in terms of the politics and in terms of what's in favour and what's out of favour. And we talk an awful lot in the climate space about the need for long-term, stable decision-making, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, that is the one thing. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. In terms of political cycles, it's a really difficult matchup, because the political cycle is always going to be shorter than the action cycle that you actually want to sort of set in train and make sure that you are, in fact, on a predictable, even if it's a roller coaster, at least you're still going forwards, I guess. The fact that this is getting political, I find interesting, if I'm really honest, because that usually means that actually it's touching a nerve. There is an understanding that there is genuinely, as David says, an increasingly urgent problem around which action does need to be taken. I think it's partly because the public are beginning to understand that, yes, things are going to have to change a bit. Lifestyles are going to have to change, whether we're talking about heating homes or the way we travel or whatever it might be. This is not a thing that's just going to sort of happen in the background that they're not going to notice. Now, what we're very bad at is explaining what that actually means, and that some of that could be quite good, because people don't always like change, especially when it's poorly explained to them, and perhaps it's politicised at that very local level. It's really, really difficult. And we are seeing that play out right across the UK at the moment, without a doubt. But I think, so I guess what I'm trying to say is it sort of feels like it's quite useful that that's starting to happen, because I think it might start to trigger some action. I mean, I took great heart actually to see over this summer just gone, even despite government recess and so on that happens at this time of year, actually the fact that we know that the Bank of England has been advised, and this is all publicly documented, they have been advised about essentially the risk of inaction. Yes. Which is very interesting. I think there's a really important point that I always find it's useful just to say out loud. The cost of not doing things in this space, the cost of not going fast enough is not zero. The cost of not doing things actually adds cost and risk. It's not a sort of a, do a thing or don't do a thing, pay some money or don't pay some money. It's, well, pay here or pay later, and probably pay more later. And so the Bank of England has received pretty significant advice, having acknowledged climate risk for 10 years now as a genuine systemic risk that could actually seriously affect the UK economy in terms of that resilience risk in particular. They are now advised, in a formal sense, that both climate and nature risk together are in combination an even more powerful risk. So the estimates that have come out from some pretty weighty academic and industry sources and so on, it estimates that risk as between, I think, 6 and 14% of GDP. That is bigger than the impact of COVID. That's bigger than the impact of the financial crash of 2008. And okay, it might not all happen at once, but the fact that it's there and seen and acknowledged, it's a really, really big deal, because actually ignoring it, as I say, the cost of ignoring it is not zero.
I like this, from net zero to not zero.
Exactly. Now you've solved my line.
It's really, I think that's a really good point. And if I look back, 2018 was quite a a point in time when the finance community started to understand through things like the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, that investing in fossil fuel investments was not sustainable and not a good thing to do going forward, and started to push for how can they find investments that were going to be sustainable and actually align with what we were trying to achieve in terms of reducing our impact on the environment. And as that 2018 was a real period where we started to get to ask for more reporting data, what actions are we going to take, and we started to see things like green bonds start to appear. So that impacts on what the cost of raising debt would look like. So when you start to see government and then the finance industries, that's where it starts to make a real difference in terms of helping the narrative and helping what we're trying to do.
But I think, just to jump on top of that point briefly also, it's also helping to kind of coordinate and streamline and align what people are trying to do, because it was, if we're honest, to a degree, the Wild West not very many years ago, in that sort of time frame where a company could say almost whatever they liked. And as long as it was a genuine sort of ambition that you might or might not get to, okay, best endeavours and all that, just trying to do the right things. But things like TCFD and now the TNFD, which is the nature equivalent side of things, which is beginning to bubble, and other regulatory pieces, plus actually the worry about greenwashing that affects many of the big corporates. People don't want to be seen to be getting it wrong. It puts everyone in a very difficult position because of what they might have said before. But actually part of being a sort of mature, grown-up organisation, whether it's public or private sector, I think, is about saying, okay, that genuinely is what we thought was the right way to express it a few years ago. However, times have changed, regulation has changed. We now see that a better way to frame it would be like this. And this is genuinely now a sort of a stated ambition that's actually much more evidence-driven, as you were saying, and much more based in sort of core nuggets of real data that actually means there's a better chance, I think, even if it shifts the lens of ambition and the peak of the roller coaster, perhaps, I don't know. If it does that, at least then there's a chance of it actually being something you could believe in.
Well, you've almost seamlessly brought me on to the next point about data, really. So you've already described beautifully how data has started to inform maybe some of these changes as well. But what role does it play in driving meaningful action for you, David, especially for early stage decisions? And you mentioned whole system change before, but data is important there as well, right?
Yeah. I would say if you're looking at data in isolation, it doesn't do anything. It's meaningless because and I see this from time to time when an organisation will say, this product has so many tons of carbon in it. Fantastic. So what do I do with that? So what?
That catapults you back to where you started.
Absolutely.
Really. Yeah.
So this is why this is akin to behaviour change, because it needs that leadership and it needs to understand what are we actually trying to achieve, what we're going to be using that data for. And so when we've been looking at our data within Anglian Water, we've been measuring the carbon impact of our business plan since about 2010. And our business plan currently is about £6 billion over a 5-year period in terms of pure capital investment that we're looking to do. And so when you start to measure your carbon impacts over significant capital programs, that means you're creating a baseline, and that means you can then use that data to challenge the supply chain and others to reduce carbon significantly against that baseline. It's common sense, and it's a key driver in terms of that leadership, that governance, and the behaviours that we're trying to generate here. So that's where data is really important in terms of performance and understanding where carbon hotspots are. That almost comes down to other examples I can give. So if we were looking to put a water main in the ground, traditionally we would have excavated a trench, put the water main in and reinstate that trench. And the carbon emissions were in the pipeline, but they were more significant within the trench itself. And so we were looking at how we can do no-dig techniques. So you'd have a launch pit and a reception pit. And then it came to a point of how can we reduce the excavational size of those launch and reception pits? How can we extend the distance between the two? And this is where the carbon data starts to be able to challenge our design engineers, rather than talking about how do we reduce carbon and all these different scenarios. It's practical and it's pragmatic in terms of what we are trying to achieve. And on the on the climate resilience side, we're seeing something similar here, where again, there's a great industry government project underway called CREDO, which is a climate resilience demonstrator. And it's almost akin to a connected digital twin, where with UK Power Networks and with British Telecom and ourselves, we're looking at the data that we have and how different climate scenarios can impact on the assets that we operate. Mm-hmm. And we might think that we might have a water treatment works which is protected from a flood zone, but a UKPM might have a transformer or a substation where that is in the flood zone. And if that floods, we lose power to our site. And because of that connection, we are impacted by that flood as well. Now, unless we're using the data in the right way to understand how those different scenarios and how those floods, droughts, storm events can change over a number of decades, we then don't understand how do we invest in our infrastructure and where are our risks. So from a resilience aspect, we can use that data to really understand and plan where our investments are alongside other infrastructure and asset owners.
So give us a WSP example as well, Rachel, if you wouldn't mind.
So in terms of data and I guess real projects and what's actually going on inside our business at the moment, one of the things that I was very close to, for really all of this year and last year as well, we've just been trying to get a grip on actually who has what carbon data in their projects, because we cross a lot of different sectors. And some sectors are really alive to this, and some are sort of looking a little bemused, shall we say? And it's the fault of the entire supply chain. It's just a level of interest that exists or doesn't exist across the different sectors for the built environment. So what we've discovered over the last, as I say, year plus, is that actually we do now have hundreds of examples at the level of individual projects, some really, really big, some really, really tiny, where people have done work to assess the carbon data associated with that particular project. What is the impact of this project? What type of project is it? Where are the impacts? When are the impacts? Over what length of time and so on? And it's fascinating to look at the big picture across all of it, because you can see there's a huge amount of data, for example, in the buildings and the transport space, because it's an area where, as whole sectors and as government departments and similar, it's been pushed really, really hard for quite a long time. Other sectors, especially some of the ones where an awful lot of money is being invested right now in the UK in particular, it's a huge game of catch up going on right now in terms of looking around and starting to learn from each other. And I think that is in the round a really powerful exercise that we're going through, and something that we're very, very keen to share more about going forward.
Let's just add in, if we may, this famous tension, cost versus carbon. We haven't got much time left. I could chat to you guys all day, honestly, but let's see if we can just zoom in on this. How do we balance the short-term investments with longer-term resilience and the system benefits that you're sort of describing to me?
Yeah, the cost carbon debate is a good one, because traditionally, and when I first started, it was almost carbon. If we want to reduce carbon, it's going to cost more. And when we were talking to our suppliers in terms of challenging, the response was, we're already doing a lot in this space. If you want to reduce carbon, how much more are you going to pay us to deliver it? That was the wrong answer, because there's no magic pot of money here. And that's where the belief comes through in terms of, well, if I'm reducing the energy required for the materials that I'm using, and if I'm reducing the quantity of materials, that's going to be reducing the cost of what I'm delivering. And so it's not looking at individual products, it's looking at the outcome I'm looking to achieve.
Right.
And again, PAS 2080 plays a part here in terms of, can I avoid building an asset? Can I switch? Can I improve what I am doing? Can I use a different type of material? Can I reuse an existing asset? Those things all save cost. Now, there is a tipping point we get to, and this is where the regulator in the water industry has been really good, because they're looking at how they can encourage the industry to reduce emissions. And that's where we're seeing things where we might have to put additional investment in. So when we're looking at lower carbon concretes, which again is an infrastructure client group project that we're working through, how do we look to reduce that tipping point and make those lower carbon concrete solutions more commercially viable in the future as well? So it's not a case of every single carbon investment that we make in every single solution costs less. No, it doesn't. Roughly in our experience, about 70% are on that cost reduction. But it's almost looking forward for the next 10 years, where are my carbon hotspots? Things like concrete and steel are significant. So how do I look at using green steel, low carbon concretes, but also look to how do I reduce the cost of using those products in the future? That's where the value chain comes to play. So it's not resolved by one part of the organisation, it's the value chain.
Okay, let's bring Rachel in here. I know she's itching to speak.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to make the link again between that data point and the cost carbon relationship point, but also then just to widen it out again in terms of our climate cake that we were talking about. So as David just mentioned, in terms of some of the work that the infrastructure client group has been doing most recently, so this has been for the last couple of years with around about, a dozen or so of the clients within that bigger group, if that makes sense. We've had a really good dig into some of the existing data that does exist and some of the data that doesn't yet exist in terms of concrete. Exactly to your point, because we know in the broad built environment space that concrete is, an extremely commonly used material, and it's something that isn't fully understood in terms of the different types of material you could be using in terms of the use cases of different things. So what we've been doing, just to kind of try to explain it as succinctly as possible, is we've been trying to bring together where is there data, where are there good examples, what amount of actual concrete of what types do all of these infrastructure clients plan to pour over the next, say, 10 years? And you know what? Nobody knew. Nobody knew, because in the individual portfolios for investment, there was an understanding of, okay, well, if we're given, to your point, David, if we're given this much money, then we'll go ahead with those projects and we can estimate what's involved there. But some sectors had a lot more data than others, and some hadn't even really started thinking about this. So what we've been trying to do is to basically pull together a single picture that says, okay, so if you're given this much money, if you go ahead with that portfolio, which is what you'd like to do, then it starts to show the demand for this material going forward. And then what can you do about it to your so what point is, okay, now we know that, we can actually start to take some action on, where are those hotspots? How can we start to pull it down? So that's now a very, very frequent sort of regular drumbeat of the conversation around that ICG table. And the even more exciting point in terms of widening it is we've now got a nature accelerator as well as a concrete decarb accelerator. And the start point is identical. It's really interesting to see how, having gone around many, many conversations to kind of explore it and figure out, right, what actually is the task that this group of infrastructure clients could do together to make the biggest difference in this space. And the answer is very simply to understand, right, in terms of natural capital as it currently exists in the ownership of these infrastructure clients, who has what potential does it have in terms of supporting, nature restoration and so on? Because some of these clients own a heap of land and are essentially net contributors potentially to improving and restoring a natural environment and so on, whilst decarbonising, whilst supporting climate resilience, all these big points. And some, of course, are in net need because they don't have the same land ownership. But hang on a minute, put it all together, and we haven't yet done this work. This is the magic that's going to happen hopefully over the course of the rest of this year and into next year. Put it all together, and all of a sudden you think, well, hang on a minute. Collectively, we could make much more of a difference. We could make sure that every investment packs more of a punch because we're actually doing things that are essential and necessary and take best advantage of that total ownership that's in our control, as opposed to just doing it one at a time, which we know is never going to give us the best answer.
Yeah, this is genius. It's almost sounds so, you make it sound so simple, but I'm sure it's not. I'm afraid we're running out of time. And I have to ask you, we always ask this question. If you had the power to change just one thing right now to create positive impact in this space, what would it be and why? David, we'll start with you.
I'm going to use a term that Chris Stark shared when he was with the Climate Change Committee, and that is that 2050 is the date, if we're delivering net zero, when we stop damaging our planet. So if I had that magic wand and I could do whatever we wanted, it would be to bring that urgency forward. And actually, similar to when we had COVID and we think about the urgency of finding vaccines, etc., and we realise the importance of quick, swift action, that's what I would start with right now. I would say that the time for talking is really over. We might make mistakes along the journey, but let's start taking action in terms of the investments and the things that we need to do to start significantly reducing our emissions, and also playing our part in terms of making sure things are resilient in the future.
It's a good one. Rachel?
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, my one thing. I think I would ban the excuse that, it's all terribly big and complicated, and what difference can my little thing make to the bigger picture of climate action? I would ban that and say, right, There are some no regrets, really obvious things that you, in whoever you are, whatever your domain is, you can control and you could make a difference to. And I would simply challenge people to say, well, what is it that's yours to do? What are you going to do?
Get on with it.
Because that creates the positive action. Because at that point, it removes the excuse.
Yes, very good, very good. Now, I know, David, you said the time for talking is over, but I'm so glad you both made the time because that was fascinating. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for on this episode of Positive Impact. A huge thank you to our guests, Rachel Skinner and David Riley, for such a thoughtful and energising conversation. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate and share. You can find more information and resources in the episode description. Thanks for listening, and do join us again next time as we continue exploring ideas that shape a smarter, greener future. I'm Lucy Siegle, and this is Positive Impact. Goodbye.